Hello, Daniel Jones here again with a presentation which I gave back in 2022 at the Christianity and Literature Study Group, which then was hosted online. It was scheduled to be in Montreal. And this is a paper called Sacred Space or Sacred Destruction, in which I explore the famous incident of St. Boniface and the Oak of Geismar and the first account of that in order to learn what we today can learn from these medieval encounters between nature and paganism. I think it's a really rich, interesting example and one that's quite relevant to our current times. So I hope you enjoy. The story of St. Boniface, the 8th century English missionary to pagan Germany who chopped down the sacred oak of Geismar, was first described by Boniface's successor Willibrord in his Life of Boniface, which was written between 763 and 768 CE. Yet it has been told and retold ever since. Depending on the motives of the teller, it has taken on the characteristics of a triumphant vindication of the Christian God over pagan idols, a myth that explains the origins of the first Christmas tree. That's actually how I first encountered the story as a child. Or a foretaste of the ecological destruction which would accompany Christianity's progress in Europe. But most frequently, the encounter has been read as a power struggle between Christianity and paganism, with one scholar describing the incident as a spiritual power encounter, a conflict not between men but between the gods that is reminiscent of Elijah's standoff with the prophets of Baal. According to this reading, by destroying that living icon of pagan power, the oak, St. Boniface proved that his Christian God was the true God of creation, which resulted in the mass conversion of the area's indigenous peoples. Now, to our modern ecological sensibility, St. Boniface's decision to chop down that sacred oak seems excessively destructive and, well, perhaps even tragic. I'm recording this now from my home, which is at the edge of Pacific Spirit Park in Vancouver, British Columbia. In my often weekly walk through Pacific Spirit, I'm always impressed and refreshed by the soaring 100-year-old Douglas firs which surround me. And yet, on those same walks, I'm also haunted by a sense of melancholy when I pass by the massive stumps, which are all that remain of the former old-growth forest that was clear-cut over 100 years ago. Those stumps are a sad reminder of the splendor that would have remained had our forefathers, and I use that gendered word deliberately, been less destructive. Yet, when I wrote this paper, just southwest of where I live, the future of some of British Columbia's activists and logging companies at Fairy Creek were engaged in a bitter debate over the future of some of British Columbia's last old-growth forests. No wonder then that in 1967, Lynn White Jr. linked the actions of medieval missionaries like Boniface to the West's continued destruction of the environment. He wrote that the whole concept of the sacred grove is alien to Christianity and to the ethos of the West, since, for nearly 2 millennia, Christian missionaries have been chopping down sacred groves, which are idolatrous because they assume spirit in nature. Well, the truth is that our society continues to chop down sacred groves. And so I think Christians today need to wrestle with Boniface's actions and the trajectory they set. If our God is the God of all creation, why was Boniface driven to destroy that oak? Well, clarity comes when we read Willibrord's Life of Boniface against the background of an 8th century understanding of Christian sacred space. In what follows, I will first introduce how early Christianity understood sacred space. I will then pay careful attention to the metaphors that Willibrord uses in his Life of Boniface, metaphors which suggest that Boniface had a positive relationship to nature. Therefore, according to Willibrord, I think Boniface's action against the oak was motivated by his pastoral concern for those in his flock who were tempted to syncretism. Boniface's transformation of the pagan oak into a sacred space under the authority of the Roman Church aligned with this existing Christian understanding of space. I will conclude by asking what implications Boniface's positive relationship to the land might have for those of us who encounter neo-pagan nature worship today. All right, let's begin with the Christian understanding of sacred space. Unlike pagan religions, early Christianity saw no distinction between sacred and secular space. Their God was the creator of everything, whose temple was in every believer's heart. Historian Robert Marcus, goals, for me anyways, writes that in contrast with the pagans who needed to worship in special buildings or at certain sacred groves, it was the consecration of the Eucharist which made any gathering place holy, be it a home or a catacomb. Therefore, he wrote, Christians inhabited an undifferentiated spatial universe, since their God was wholly present everywhere at once, allowing no site, no building or space, any specially privileged holiness. Yet by the 4th century, the cult of the martyrs and the preservation of their relics meant that certain places began to be set apart, so that the church, according to Marcus, acquired a sacred geography. When the church housed a relic, it became a microcosm of the heavenly kingdom, and was thus set apart from the rest of the world. So these parallel ideas, God ruling over all creation, and then relic-consecrated churches becoming sacred space, would influence Boniface's mission in the 8th century. St. Boniface's life and mission can be understood as the extension of this Roman Christianity I just described into the contested space of barbarian Europe. Born in England in 680 CE, Boniface joined an Exeter monastery at age 5 and was ordained a priest at age 30. Although he was asked to become the abbot of his monastery, Boniface instead felt called to be a missionary to the German Saxon tribes. His first missionary journey took place in 716, and 2 years later, Boniface traveled to Rome to meet with Pope Gregory II, who commissioned him as a missionary and later ordained him as Bishop of Germany. It was shortly after this ordination that Boniface traveled to Hesse in Germany and had his encounter with the great oak of Thor, destroying it and using the wood to build a chapel to St. Peter. Now, our only description of this famous incident comes from Willibald of Manaz's Life of Boniface. Now, Willibald, who was ordained by Boniface, wrote his account of Boniface's life approximately 13 years after Boniface's death. In this sensitively written biography, Willibald uses a remarkable metaphor when describing Boniface's first missionary journey into the German territories. Thus, like the busy bee which, borne along by its softly buzzing wings, flits over flower fields and meadows and picks its way among 1,000 different sweet-smelling flowers, testing with its discriminating tongue the secret hoards of honey-bearing nectar, and completely ignoring all the bitter and poisonous juices, and then comes back with nectar to its hive and, to use an illustration from the words of the apostle, tests all things and holds on to what is good. So, Willibald's metaphor is notable for its optimistic understanding of these foreign lands. All of God's earth was available to Boniface, the busy bee, like a bountiful harvest ready to bear the good fruit of sweet-smelling flowers and honey-bearing nectar. There's a little sense of fear or trepidation. However, there are still areas of bitter and poisonous juices which needed the discernment of a discriminating tongue. So despite God's reign over the land, there were still pitfalls and dangers which Boniface needed to approach with wisdom. And because of the area's pagan roots, the worship of Saxon gods through nature was a constant temptation for new Christians. Willibald explicitly mentions the danger of this syncretism when he writes that some continued secretly, others openly, to offer sacrifices to trees and springs. Historians agree in their description of this syncretism. Medievalist Shannon Godlove clarifies that Boniface did not encounter a land of pure paganism, but rather one in which Christianity had already made inroads. Likewise, historian Timothy Router establishes that Boniface's world was one of lapsed and backsliding converts, which was incompletely and imperfectly Christian. So it was within this context of syncretism that Boniface engaged in his pastoral work. Boniface's motivation for his drastic action against the oak was his pastoral care for those in his congregation who were tempted by syncretism. This can be discerned in Willibard's language just before he describes that chopping down. Others, not yet strong in the spirit, refuse to accept the pure teachings of the church in their entirety. What I think is remarkable in that phrase, not yet strong in the spirit, is Willibard's lack of condemnation for those who are tempted. Instead, he implies that these new converts had not yet attained spiritual maturity. Willibard also mentions that Boniface chose to chop down the tree only after getting the counsel and advice of those who showed exclusive devotion to Christianity, mature believers from the tribes. Therefore, Boniface's act was not a spontaneous decision, but was done with the advice of others and out of care for those who did not yet have the spiritual strength to resist syncretism. When Boniface proceeds to take action against the oak, we might expect the emphasis to be on the saint's own ability to destroy the tree. Instead, Willibald's description of the incident emphasizes how God enlists the forces of nature to topple the tree. While Boniface is the instigator, it is God who actually brings down the oak through nature, through a powerful wind. Taking his courage in his hands, for a great crowd of pagans stood by watching and bitterly cursing in their hearts the enemy of the gods, he cut the first notch. But when he had made a superficial cut, suddenly the oak's vast bulk, shaken by a mighty blast of wind from above, crashed to the ground, shivering its topmost branches into fragments in its fall, as if by the express will of God, for the brethren present had done nothing to cause it. The oak burst asunder into 4 parts, each part having a trunk of equal length. So in this account, God's power is made manifest through nature, a mighty blast of wind from above, and is clearly shown to be the cause of the oak's demise, as if by the express will of God. God is not depicted in opposition to nature, but rather works through nature to prove God's lordship. This is consistent with the advice Boniface received from a letter written by Bishop Daniel of Winchester shortly after Boniface's ordination, in which the bishop encourages him to emphasize the power of the Creator God over the pagan gods by demonstrating God's control over nature. So John Henry Clay, a scholar, is correct when he insists that the physical landscape itself was a crucible of cultural conflict and conversion, at the heart of which, both physically and spiritually, stood the Geismar shrine. So rather than wantonly destroying the physical landscape, Boniface, in effect, collaborates with it in order to demonstrate the power of the God who rules over it. And Boniface did not just destroy the oak, but used its raw materials to build a sacred space that aligned with the Roman Church. Willibald's very next sentence reads, "Thereupon the holy bishop took counsel with the brethren, built an oratory from the timber of the oak, and dedicated it to St. Peter, the apostle," of course. What was previously a temptation to idolatry has been transformed into a sacred space for the worship of the true God. That which was pagan has now become rather sacred, so that nature now contributes to the worship of God. Part of this transformation is the explicit connection to the Church of Rome, for Boniface dedicates the new church to Peter, the Pope's predecessor. Moreover, since Willibald describes Pope Gregory giving Boniface Roman relics 3 separate times in his account, I think we can assume that Boniface used those relics to consecrate the new chapel. So Boniface's action therefore aligns with the Christian understanding of churches with relics as being distinctly holy within an already sacred world. Now, I'd like to conclude with two codas, one from Boniface's life and the other from my own. The first comes from the last chapter of Willibald's life. While many scholars believe this chapter to be a later addition to the text, I find its details consistent with how Willibald has described Boniface's interaction with nature. The story takes place years after the saint's martyrdom. Because of the violent tides in the area where he was slain, both church authorities and the people decide to raise a mound of earth where the saint was killed. Upon this mound, they plan to build a church and a monastery. Yet, in their efforts to avoid nature's disruptive tides, the people encounter another natural challenge: the area's lack of fresh water. Here's the account. The residents and inhabitants of the district began to discuss the difficulty of obtaining fresh water, for throughout almost all of Frisia this is a great problem both for man and beast. At once, an astonishing miracle happened, worthy to be remembered by all those who were present and saw it. From the mound, a fountain of water, much clearer than any found in that country, extraordinarily sweet and pleasant to the taste, came bubbling up and flowed out through innumerable channels until it formed a considerable stream. Astounded at this miracle, they returned to their homes in joy and gladness, spreading the news in the churches of what they had seen. Apocryphal or not, although this Willibald does claim that the authorities who told it to him and insists the event itself was collaborated by eyewitnesses, I find this story to encapsulate many of the themes that I've been tracing. The previously pagan practice of building a burial mound has been repurposed so that a place already made sacred by a martyr's death can now become a Christian church. On this twice sacred site, nature becomes blessed, miraculously serving the needs of both man and beast, so that the spirits and bodies of all living beings who encounter it are refreshed with joy and gladness. Rather than working in opposition to nature, even after his death, Boniface's ministry has enriched it. And now, a story from my own life. One of my favorite forests in all the world is found in Helliwell Provincial Park, which is on Hornby Island, a Gulf island nestled between Vancouver Island and the mainland. I discovered this section of the forest years ago by following an easily missed footpath that led off the main trail and into the heart of the forest. This path wanders past several towering, old-growth giants, including massive Douglas firs and arbutus trees. I have spent many happy hours wandering among these trees, often climbing into them to sit and read. In fact, on our honeymoon 5 years ago, my wife and I chose to rent a cabin within walking distance of this forest so we could visit it often. Yet at the heart of that forest, there's a certain big leaf maple tree, which I never linger by. I don't have a photo of this tree. I've always been too spooked by it, but we'll just put that photo, which is a photo of actually one of the oaks near Germany that Willibald, or rather Boniface, chopped down. Now, this tree on Hornby, not the one pictured, has been transformed into what I assume is a neo-pagan shrine. There are prayer flags, there are circles of white stones, and there are countless animal skulls placed very carefully around its trunk. Now, I have to say, I'm not someone who normally senses any kind of spiritual darkness, but every time I've walked past that tree, I've been haunted by what I've always felt to be a kind of dark malevolence. If I think about coming upon that tree at night, I shudder. I would never do it. I'd avoid it. While I do not know the details of how that tree is used by those who have placed such talismans around it, and any kind of ministry to those people would involve listening to that, but I wonder if the spiritual power I sense there is similar to what Boniface encountered at the Oak of Geismar. If I were a missionary to Hornby Island, or a priest there, I would not suggest chopping down that big leaf maple, even if I had the assistance of a powerful divine wind. Yet I wonder if we in the 21st century can learn from Boniface's general approach, even as we resist copying that specifically destructive practice. Like Boniface, we can celebrate the gifts of nature, recognizing all of it as belonging to and being sustained by our Creator, even as we are aware of the ways it can be bent towards dark spiritual practices. Responding to these abuses of nature requires pastoral sensitivity and the advice of others. And I think, given Western Christianity's track record with nature and indigenous spirituality, I would suggest against outright destroying any such shrines, but rather trying to learn from them. Like Boniface in the 8th century, the Church today should continue to create spaces that are made sacred through the consecration of the Eucharist and which reflect the beauty and sacredness of the natural world. As I've argued in another presentation you can find in this YouTube channel on learning from Anglo-Saxon Christian worship practices. We should pray that our lives of devotion to others and to the natural world itself will bless the natural world and those who live in it, just like Boniface's tomb became a place of physical blessing to others. Indeed, despite my repulsion to that one big leaf maple tree in Halliwell Park, the trees that surround it are some of my favorite natural places on the coast. I'm constantly drawn back to those neighboring trees and would even say that I have received spiritual strength from dwelling near their beauty. Thank you for listening. If you made it this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I have to say that it's been 2 years since I gave this presentation, and I think my understanding of my appreciation of indigenous spirituality and what we can learn from it has increased. And I think our understanding of God's presence through nature, in nature even, is very rich and should be developed more. But I hope that this historical snapshot is helpful and interesting, and I would suggest watching us an accompanying video of the talk I gave this year on Anglo-Saxon worship practices and what we can learn from them. Thank you for listening.